You have exactly 48 hours, Mr. Davies, to dismantle that structure, or we take it down for you and send you the bill." The words, clipped and devoid of warmth, hung in the sweltering August air. Julian Davies, a man whose hands were usually covered in wood shavings or garden soil, gripped the armrest of his chair, knuckles white. The HOA's self-appointed enforcer, Mrs. Albright, sat opposite him, her posture rigid, her gaze unwavering, as if she expected him to spontaneously combust. Behind her, a younger, nervous man, Mr. Henderson, clutched a tablet displaying Julian's property aerial view, the offending treehouse, a stark, innocent blot on the green. This wasn't a courtroom, but the tiny, overly air-conditioned meeting room in the community center felt like one, complete with its own judge and executioner. Julian knew this wasn't just about a treehouse. It was about perceived order, about control, about a personal vendetta that had simmered for months, boiling over now that his daughter, Chloe, had finally finished decorating the inside, painting stars on the ceiling. Julian had been preparing for this day for weeks, ever since the first terse notice had been stapled to his DORA demand to cease construction. Then, another, threatening fines. And now, this, a final ultimatum. He'd tried to be reasonable, even tried to invite Mrs. Albright over to see it, to understand it wasn't some haphazard monstrosity, but a carefully planned, professionally built haven. He'd presented sketches, even the engineering all had been dismissed with a wave of her hand and a chilling reminder of Article 7, Section C, Subsection 2 of the Covenants. No unapproved exterior structures impacting community aesthetics or property values. He knew the rules, had read them thoroughly before buying the house 2 years ago. And he also knew Mrs. Albright's history, her reputation for ruthlessness. How she'd once forced the elderly Mr. Peterson to repaint his house because its shade of beige was deemed too off-white by her discerning eye. But this was different. This wasn't just about paint. This was about Chloe, about a dream they'd built together, a fortress of childhood imagination that he was now being ordered to demolish. The HOA board meeting had been set for today, August 12th at 3 p.m. It felt less like a democratic assembly and more like an inquisition. The other board members, a mix of retirees and busy professionals, sat around the polished conference table, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge Mrs. Albright. Their collective silence was a heavy weight, pressing down on Julian. He felt his throat tighten. This wasn't just a simple property dispute. It felt deeply personal. The way Mrs. Albright looked at him, the subtle curl of her lip, it wasn't just about the treehouse, it was about him. He'd been the new guy, the single dad who worked from home, the one who sometimes let his lawn grow a little longer than manicured perfection. He'd seen the glances, felt the unspoken judgment. He suspected a deeper, unacknowledged issue at play. Something about his presence, his easygoing nature, that perhaps grated against the tightly wound expectations of the community. He was the outsider, and his treehouse was simply the latest, most visible manifestation of his nonconformity. He'd prepared for legal skirmishes, for appeals, for a long, drawn-out battle. He'd anticipated the arguments about property values, about aesthetics, but he hadn't anticipated the sheer force of their collective will, their unwavering certainty. "Mr. Davies, are you quite finished staring into space?" Mrs. Albright's voice, sharp as a winter frost, cut through his thoughts. "We have other matters to attend to." He looked at her, then at Mr. Henderson, who quickly averted his eyes. Julian noticed a tremor in Henderson's hand as he adjusted the tablet, a flicker of doubt, perhaps, or just fear of Mrs. Albright. Julian had done his homework, not just on HOA covenants, but on Mrs. Albright herself. He knew about her family's past, their deep roots in this community, how her father had been one of the original developers, how her family had essentially shaped the very rules that governed this place. He also knew about a particular zoning dispute years ago concerning a wetland area on the community's eastern border, a detail that most residents had long forgotten, but which had resonated with Julian for reasons he couldn't yet fully explain. That specific detail, something seemingly innocuous, had guided his strategy from the moment he realized the battle lines were drawn. He hadn't just built a treehouse, he'd built it with a very specific, deeply hidden ace up his sleeve, an ace that was far more powerful than any architectural drawing or covenant clause. He was ready to play it, but not yet. Not until they had fully committed to their path. He needed them to dig their heels in deep. "I'm quite finished, Mrs. Albright." Julian replied, his voice calm, belying the rapid thrum of his pulse. "But I haven't heard a single valid argument as to why my treehouse, which is structurally sound, visually appealing, and brings immense joy to my daughter, should be torn down. I've reviewed the covenants thoroughly. It adheres to all setback requirements. It's not obstructing any views. And it's clearly not a commercial enterprise." Mrs. Albright scoffed, a delicate, dismissive sound that infuriated Julian more than an outright shout would have. "Aesthetics, Mr. Davies. Community harmony. We have a standard here, a certain quality of life we uphold. Your contraption does not fit. It's an eyesore. It devalues the properties around you. I've received no less than 5 complaints, including from Mrs. Gable directly across from you." Julian turned slightly, catching Mrs. Gable's eye. She was a woman in her late 60s, usually quite friendly, who now looked away quickly, her cheeks flushing. This wasn't a genuine complaint, Julian realized. This was orchestrated. He knew Mrs. Albright had her ways of encouraging cooperation. He knew the complaints were likely coerced or amplified. The community wasn't some idyllic, harmonious bubble. There were subtle power dynamics at play, whispered grievances, and undercurrents of resentment. Mrs. Albright, with her perfectly coiffed silver hair and her designer suits, was the undisputed queen of this particular castle, and she ran it with an iron fist, masked by a velvet glove. And what about Mrs. Albright's own contraption? Julian thought, recalling the elaborate, almost ostentatious gazebo she'd erected in her sprawling backyard 2 summers ago. A structure that surely stretched the definition of community aesthetics. He knew the board, then headed by a more lenient president, had quietly approved it without much fuss. The rules, it seemed, applied differently depending on who was enforcing them, and more importantly, who was being enforced upon. This was the systemic injustice he was fighting, not just for his treehouse, but for the principle of fairness, for the idea that rules should be applied equally to everyone. Not just as instruments of personal power, I've already addressed the aesthetic concerns in my written submission. Julian continued, keeping his voice level. It's built with high quality, sustainably sourced cedar, designed to blend with the natural environment. It's actually quite beautiful. He remembered the long, cold winter evenings he'd spent poring over designs, the crisp, sunny spring mornings building the frame. The excitement in Chloe's eyes as she watched it take shape, piece by careful piece. This wasn't just a structure. It was a testament to his love for his daughter. A promise he'd made to her after a particularly tough year. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. "Mr. Davies," Mrs. Albright said, a tight smile on her lips that didn't reach her eyes. "And in this community, the beholder is the Homeowners Association Board, and we deem it inappropriate. A blight on our perfectly curated landscape. The board has voted. The decision is final. Dismantle it, or we will." Her voice was a pronouncement, a gavel striking down. This was it. The moment he'd been waiting for, the full, unwavering commitment to their position. He could feel the tension in the room, the silent agreement, the subtle shifting of bodies that signaled the end of the discussion. They believed they had him cornered. They believed they had one. He could almost hear the collective sigh of relief from the other board members, eager to move on from this unpleasantness. He remembered Chloe's laughter echoing from the treehouse just yesterday. The way the late afternoon sun had glinted off the small, hand-painted sign that read, the thought of that laughter being silenced, that sign being torn down, fueled a cold resolve within him. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for that joy, for that innocence, for the right to simply exist without constant scrutiny and arbitrary enforcement. He was fighting for his daughter's future. For a home where she felt safe and free, Julian slowly reached into his worn leather briefcase, extracting a thick, official-looking folder. The movement was deliberate. Each action weighted with a calm he didn't entirely feel. Mrs. Albright watched him, a flicker of irritation in her eyes, probably assuming he was pulling out more futile architectural drawings or legal precedents from obscure case law. Mr. Henderson, however, leaned forward slightly, his initial nervousness giving way to a hint of curiosity. "Before we conclude," Julian said, his voice now a little louder, carrying more authority than before, "I have some additional documentation. It pertains directly to the land on which my property, and indeed a significant portion of this community, sits." He pushed the folder across the table, not towards Mrs. Albright, but towards the center, where it lay, a silent challenge. The cover was plain, but the government seals on the internal documents were unmistakable. Mrs. Albright raised an eyebrow. A dismissive gesture. "Mr. Davies, we've seen enough of your documentation. Your attempts to delay the inevitable are futile," Julian conceded, a small enigmatic smile playing on his lips. "But I assure you, this isn't about delay, it's about clarity. Specifically, clarity regarding the environmental permits governing construction in this area, particularly concerning areas designated as critical habitat for certain protected species, and the buffer zones required around them." The words hung in the air, shifting the mood in the room subtly. The other board members exchanged uneasy glances. Protected species, critical habitat. This was a new variable, one that clearly hadn't been factored into their unanimous vote. However, remained unruffled, though a faint line appeared between her brows. "Mr. Davies, this community was developed decades ago. All necessary environmental clearances were obtained at the time. This is a residential area, not a nature preserve." "Indeed," Julian responded, his eyes meeting hers directly. "And that's precisely why these documents are so relevant. They outline specific conditions and agreements made with state and federal environmental agencies prior to the initial groundbreaking in 1998, conditions that, I believe, may have been overlooked in subsequent years, or perhaps intentionally disregarded, especially regarding certain constructions." He paused, letting the implication sink in, watching her carefully. Her composure, just a moment ago rock solid, seemed to waver just perceptibly. A flicker of something, perhaps concern, perhaps recognition, crossed her face. He opened the folder, pulling out a faded but clearly legitimate map. "This is a topographical survey from 1997, overlaid with the designated critical habitat for the endangered northern spotted owlet, which was discovered in a small, isolated cluster of old-growth trees just north of what is now our community's eastern border. And this," he said, pulling out another document, "is the Environmental Impact Statement, dated January 15, 1998, outlining the buffer zones and restrictive covenants placed on construction within 100 feet of that habitat." He pointed to a specific section on the map, then on the document. "My treehouse, as you can see, is not only within the standard setback from my property line, but it also falls squarely within a pre-approved zone that actually encourages elevated, non-ground disturbing structures to minimize impact on specific ground-dwelling flora and fauna identified in this very report. In fact, its construction was meticulously planned to adhere to these very guidelines, which actually supersede general aesthetic HOA covenants when environmental protection is at stake." The silence in the room was no longer oppressive. It was heavy with dawning realization. Mr. Henderson's tablet clattered softly as he dropped it onto the table, his mouth slightly agape. The other board members were now leaning forward, their eyes fixed on the documents, then on Mrs. Albright, then back to Julian. Their collective discomfort was palpable, a stark contrast to their earlier indifference. Julian watched Mrs. Albright, looking for the tell. He saw it, a subtle clenching of her jaw, a slight paling of her complexion. He knew he had struck a nerve. He knew about the wetland dispute years ago, about the quiet rezoning, about how her family's development company had navigated or perhaps circumvented environmental regulations to maximize their profits. He knew she understood the implications. Furthermore, Julian continued, pressing his advantage, "I went through the proper channels. I secured a variance from the State Environmental Protection Agency back in April. It explicitly states that my proposed structure, by being an elevated, minimally invasive treehouse, aligns perfectly with the spirit, and indeed, the letter, of these older, but still very much active environmental protections. It's not just allowed Mrs. Albright, it's, in a strange way, encouraged as an example of responsible low-impact development within a sensitive area. They even provided me with a small grant for using reclaimed materials for part of the build. Materials which, incidentally, are far more eco-friendly than the standard treated lumber most of you used for your decks. The permit number is SEA 202-304-18-JD001, issued on April 18th of this year. You can look it up." He pushed a final document across the table, a copy of the variance, complete with state seals and official signatures. It was undeniable. Mrs. Albright stared at the document, her face now a mask of barely suppressed fury. Her carefully constructed facade was crumbling. Her power, her authority, built on decades of unchallenged dominion, was suddenly exposed as fragile, even illegitimate. The board members, now fully aware of the legal quagmire they had stepped into, were shifting uncomfortably, avoiding her gaze. They knew that if Julian's claims about the older environmental permits were true, and especially if her family's original development had somehow sidestepped these regulations, the HOA, and potentially Mrs. Albright herself, could be facing serious legal repercussions, far beyond a simple treehouse dispute. Julian hadn't just presented a defense. He had unearthed a foundational vulnerability, a skeleton in the community's meticulously manicured closet. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. The air conditioning hummed, a lonely sound in the suddenly tense room. Julian felt a strange mix of triumph and exhaustion. This wasn't the end of the battle, he knew, but it was a crucial turning point. He had faced down their intimidation, their arbitrary power, and with a carefully aimed shot, he had turned the tables. The demand to tear down his treehouse now sounded hollow, absurd, a foolish overreach that threatened to unravel far more than just a single structure, I believe. Julian said, his voice quiet but firm, that given this new information, the board might want to reconsider its 48-hour ultimatum. He leaned back in his chair, watching Mrs. Albright waiting. The tables, quite literally, had turned. Mrs. Albright's eyes narrowed, her perfect composure finally cracking. The slight tremor in her hand, the involuntary clench of her jaw. These were tiny fissures in the carefully constructed fortress of her authority. She picked up the variance document, her gaze scanning the official seals and signatures. It was no bluff. Julian had not just called her hand, he'd shown her a royal flush. The weight of her family's legacy, the carefully buried secrets of their development empire, now hung precariously in the balance. Mr. Henderson, usually a timid shadow, found his voice. Mrs. Albright, he stammered, his eyes wide with alarm. If this is true, if the original development did indeed disregard these prior environmental protections, the legal ramifications for the HOA, for all of us, could be catastrophic. Fines, lawsuits, potential stop work orders on future projects, it could unravel everything. His voice, though nervous, held a newfound conviction, born of genuine fear. The other board members, their faces etched with a mix of fear and indignation, looked from Mrs. Albright to Julian, then back to the damning documents. Mrs. Gable, who had earlier avoided Julian's gaze, now met his with a look of dawning understanding, perhaps even apology. The unspoken judgment she'd felt earlier from Mrs. Albright had been replaced by a much more visceral fear of legal repercussions. From a higher authority, this is an outrageous accusation. Mr. Davies, Mrs. Albright finally hissed, her voice low and dangerous, a predator cornered, a desperate attempt to manipulate the board with spurious claims and half-truths. But her denial lacked its usual conviction, tainted by the visible tremor in her hands as she gripped the document. Her carefully cultivated image of infallible authority was now irrevocably tarnished. "Spurious, Mrs. Albright," Julian replied calmly, maintaining eye contact. "The permit number is right there. The State Environmental Protection Agency isn't known for issuing spurious variances, especially not with a grant attached for ecological benefit. And the original EIS from 1998 is a public record. It specifically mentions a northern spotted owlet population. Do you recall that particular detail from your family's original development plans?" He paused, letting the silence hang, heavy with accusation. He knew she did. He'd seen the fear in her eyes, the momentary flash of recognition. The wetland dispute years ago, the quiet rezoning night had all revolved around similar environmental dodges. Her family had made a fortune by cutting corners, and now, one of those corners was threatening to unravel their entire legacy. This wasn't just about it was about the very foundation of her power, built on a shaky edifice of past transgressions. "I will remind you, Mr. Davies, that you are speaking about the foundational integrity of this community," Mrs. Albright said, trying to regain control, her voice trembling slightly. "My family built this community with the highest standards." "Perhaps," Julian conceded, leaning forward slightly, "but the highest standards for whom, Mrs. Albright? For the developers, who cut costs by building over sensitive habitats, or for the residents, who are now bound by rules that seem to apply selectively?" Rules that, ironically, your family's initial lack of adherence to has now created an environmental loophole that protects my He let the irony hang in the air, a bitter taste on her tongue. Mr. Henderson, emboldened by the truth and the palpable fear in the room, spoke again. More firmly this time. Mrs. Albright, with all due respect, we need to address this immediately. If Mr. Davies brings this to the attention of the state agencies, and they investigate the original EIS and our current compliance, the HOA could face significant legal and financial penalties. Our insurance might not even cover violations of this magnitude. We need to withdraw our demand, effective immediately. The other board members nodded in unison, their eyes glued to Mrs. Albright. The tide had turned completely. Their earlier discomfort had morphed into a desperate need for self-preservation. They were no longer Mrs. Albright's unquestioning loyalists. They were individuals staring down the barrel of a potential lawsuit, and Julian, the quiet single dad, had become their unexpected savior from imminent legal disaster. Mrs. Albright closed her eyes for a brief moment, a flicker of true defeat passing across her face, before she quickly masked it with a steely resolve. But it was too late. The damage was done. The air of invincibility that had surrounded her for decades had evaporated, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. She knew, in that moment, that her reign as the unchallenged matriarch of the community was over. "Very well, Mr. Davies," she said, her voice strained, each word a concession extracted with immense effort. "Given this unexpected documentation, the Homeowners Association Board will temporarily suspend its directive regarding your treehouse. We will need time to review these permits and consult with our legal counsel regarding their implications for the community's covenants. For now, the structure may remain as is." "Temporarily suspend," Julian challenged, his voice still calm but with an underlying steel. "Mrs. Albright, the variance is valid and active. The state environmental protections supersede HOA covenants on this matter. There is nothing temporary about it. My treehouse is not merely allowed to remain, it is protected by state law. An attempt to enforce your previous directive would be an illegal act, placing the HOA in direct violation of state environmental regulations." He paused, letting the full weight of his words settle. "And I believe, given the history of your family's development and the potential for a larger investigation into past environmental compliance, that the board's immediate action should be to formally rescind the ultimatum, issue a public apology, and affirm the treehouse's protected status." The room was silent. Julian wasn't just asking for his treehouse to be spared. He was demanding an acknowledgement of his victory and a public capitulation from Mrs. Albright. He was not just protecting his daughter's joy, but also shining a light on the unfairness that had permeated the community for too long. He was exposing the rotten foundation beneath the perfectly manicured lawns. Mrs. Albright's face flushed a deep crimson. To issue a public apology was an unthinkable humiliation. Yet Mr. Henderson was already nodding vigorously, and the other board members were exchanging glances, fear outweighing loyalty. They knew Julian was right. The potential fallout from a state investigation would dwarf the embarrassment of a public apology. "Mr. Davies," Mr. Henderson said, stepping in before Mrs. Albright could lash out, "I believe that would be prudent. We need to act quickly and decisively to mitigate potential damage. I move that we formally rescind the directive, issue an official letter acknowledging the state variance and the treehouse's protected status, and yes, a public apology for the oversight and distress caused." The motion was seconded almost immediately by another board member, Mrs. Chen, a usually quiet woman who now looked at Mrs. Albright with an expression that was a complex mix of triumph and relief. The power dynamic had truly shifted. Mrs. Albright was outflanked, outmaneuvered, and outnumbered. She sat rigid, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. "Fine," she bet out, her voice barely a whisper, thick with unadulterated fury. "The motion passes. But let it be known, Mr. Davies, this is not over. I believe it is." "Mrs. Albright," Julian replied, a genuine, if weary, smile finally touching his lips. "For me and for Chloe, it's just beginning. The beginning of living freely in our home, without fear of arbitrary rules." He gathered his documents, the thick folder now feeling lighter, no longer a burden, but a shield and a sword. As he stood, he looked around the table. The other board members avoided his gaze, some with shame, some with nascent respect. Mr. Henderson, however, offered a small, hesitant smile. "I need to inform Chloe," Julian said, more to himself than to them. "She's been so worried." He walked out of the frigid meeting room, leaving Mrs. Albright alone with the wreckage of her authority. The harsh August sun felt wonderfully warm on his skin after the chill of the conference room. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over Chloe's contact. He could already picture her face, her wide, joyful smile, when he told her the news. Chloe's Sky Palace was safe. More than safe, it was a symbol of resilience, of standing up for what was right, and of the enduring power of a father's love. The fight wasn't just for a tree, it was for the right to belong, for the freedom to be different, and for the principle that rules should foster community, not crush individual spirit. Julian had one not just for himself and Chloe, but for every resident who had ever felt the oppressive weight of arbitrary authority. He had shown them that even the smallest voice, armed with truth and courage, could shake the foundations of established power. As he drove home, he saw Mrs. Gable watering her flowers. She smiled at him, a genuine, warm smile, and waved. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. The community, perhaps, was finally beginning to breathe freely. Later that evening, after a celebratory dinner of pizza and ice cream, Julian sat on the porch swing, watching Chloe ascend the ladder to her treehouse. A soft glow emanated from within, the fairy lights she'd strung up twinkling like captured stars. Her laughter drifted down, pure and unburdened, a melody of triumph and joy. He knew Mrs. Albright's "this is not over" was likely a promise she intended to keep, a whisper of future skirmishes. But he also knew she had been exposed, her power significantly diminished. The other board members would be more circumspect, more willing to question her authority. The fear she had instilled for so long was beginning to dissipate, replaced by a quiet sense of empowerment among the residents. Julian thought back to the initial construction. The early mornings, the careful planning. He hadn't just built a treehouse. He'd laid the groundwork for a battle he didn't even know he'd have to fight. His initial research into the property, a casual habit born of a desire to know his new home, inside and out, had revealed the forgotten environmental reports. It was a detail he'd tucked away, a contingency, never imagining it would become his ultimate weapon. He closed his eyes, savoring the cool evening breeze and the sound of Chloe's happy hum from her perch among the leaves. The Sky Palace wasn't just a structure, it was a beacon, a testament to a father's love, a child's dream, and the quiet, persistent power of truth. And for the first time in a long time, Julian felt truly at home, not just in his house, but in his community, knowing that he had carved out a space where he and Chloe could finally, truly be free. The battle for the treehouse was won, and the future, bathed in the soft glow of fairy lights, looked infinitely brighter.